So, we know what flash is good for, and we know where it's not so good. But what should you look for when it comes to spending your hard-earned cash on one of these lovely new toys? Well, as always with equipment, you probably know what I'm going to say, you do tend to get what you pay for. One of the big advantages of the more expensive kit is not necessarily the headline features or specifications you'll see listed, but things like build quality. I have certainly in the past made a lot of false economies buying cheap, nasty gear that seems to have the same specification as kits that I should have spent more money on. It's higher up the price range, but that stuff has then fallen apart and I've ended up replacing it several times over. Buy decent kit and it will last you for far, far longer. And I really can't stress that enough. I have wasted a lot of money on cheap rubbish kit over the years. But stuff like this and this, which don't get me wrong, are expensive, they keep going and going and going. Perhaps the main thing to consider when you're considering your budget is the balance between power and portability. Predictably, the overall power, the total output if you like, in a flash gun like this is considerably less than a battery powered unit like this. So you might think, well, if I've got the money, I'll just go and get one of these. Amazing. And don't get me wrong, these are fantastic and they're incredibly versatile and I use them all the time. But think of what you're like to shoot with this flash equipment. If you think you're going to be indoors most of the time or never going that far from the car, well, something like this is absolutely fine. I can assure you though, if you were envisaging doing anything out at more remote locations or in areas that are difficult to get to in any way, this is not much fun. And this suddenly becomes your best friend. I've shot all sorts of things like adventure races with several of these, for example. I've had 3 or 4 of these in my backpack and I've carried them for mile after mile after mile. I would not have done that with one of these. Okay, so do think about what you're trying to shoot and then try and balance power and portability accordingly. Now, on the other side of the coin, if you can be pretty confident that you're almost never going to leave the indoors and you're always going to be within range of mains power, I'd strongly suggest getting a mains powered unit. Because whilst of course they're not much use outside, not without a very long cable, they'll recycle faster, you'll generally get more power in the same package, and it's just so convenient because you just plug them in and off they go. Whilst all of these battery things can be used indoors, of course, all day long, the battery's eventually going to drain, whereas, of course, that mains power thing doesn't run out of battery. It just keeps going and going and going. I mean, I have done thousands of shots within the same day with units like this. They're workhorses. They keep flashing away. This would have had to have its battery replaced about 2 or 3 times over in the same sort of period of shooting. Now, if you're trying to choose between a main system or a battery system, I would suggest start with a battery system, unless you can be dead certain you're not going to spend your entire life indoors, simply because a battery system is more versatile. If, as time passes, you find yourself basically never leaving the house or never leaving the studio, then yeah, invest in some mains kit. What you'll find is, much like my delightful Pro Photo stuff, is that of course you can get a system. So just because you buy a battery set doesn't mean that 3 or 4 years later you can't get a main set that uses exactly the same type of modifiers. You may notice both of these are exactly the same. So going back to my first point about what to choose, if you buy decent kit, you can hopefully expand and grow without having to restart and pick up other bits in funny places as you go along, because of course a decent system will allow you to, say, start out with a battery system and then later on add some main system, and everything around it, all the modifiers, even the triggers we're coming on to later, will all fit within the same system, saving you quite a lot of money and also saving you the hassle of having 3 or 4 different sets of kit. For what it's worth, I use both types. I probably use the battery ones more, simply because of course they can also be used on location, but if ever I'm in a situation where I'm indoors and I'm staying indoors, mains will always be my first choice because it just keeps on going. I don't even have to think about whether the battery power might be close to running out, whether I better put another battery on charge. They just keep slogging away. Now, units like this flash gun, which was top of the range when I bought it about 9 years ago, also come with a whole range of different exposure modes. And as is with all equipment, generally speaking, the more you pay, the more you'll get. A very cheap flash gun may have just manual power. Something like this will have manual, auto aperture, guide number flash, strobe modes, all sorts of bits and pieces, and may also let you do what's called TTL. TTL stands for through the lens. It means that the flash output in here can be perfectly synchronized with the exposure system in a matching camera. It needs to be dedicated. You couldn't take a Canon TTL flash, for example, and match it to a Nikon camera because they wouldn't talk to each other. But a Nikon TTL flash with a compatible Nikon camera will mean that I can put this on top of my camera and I can set the camera to some automatic exposure mode or other, set my flash to TTL mode, and it will give me automatic exposures with the same pros and cons of automatic exposures that the camera will give me anyway. Now is not the time to go into why I don't tend to use automatic exposure very much, because I think we've covered that enough both in my Technical Foundations course and already a few times in this course. But suffice to say, it's a handy thing to have. I tend not to use it very much, but worth knowing it's there. You don't tend to get TTL in bigger units like these. Bigger flash heads historically have always just been manual with a lot of power output variation, so you can choose how much power to spit out. In the past few years though, you are starting to get units. This one, for example, does do TTL flash with my Nikon. It uses this very, very clever trigger we're coming on to later to synchronize and talk, so the units can talk to each other. Again, I don't use it very much, but having it is quite nice, and it's definitely an extra that you will pay for. So if you think you're going to play around with automatic modes or work with lots of very, very fast moving subjects and you'll be moving too, TTL is quite a handy thing to have. Manual power output is where you're going to want to spend most of your time. And in cases like this mains unit, it's the only choice you'll have. What matters when looking for a flash unit of any sort is the amount of power output you've got in terms of a range, and then how precise within that range you're able to adjust it. This flash gun, for example, has from 1, so full power, down to 128th power output, and that gives me in total a 7 stop range, if I've got that right, and it can be adjusted in 1/3 of a stop increments, so pretty accurate. Now by comparison, this battery head here, this Profoto B1, goes from 10, while I'm holding two fingers up, goes from 10 to 2, and each one of those is a whole stop, so that's a range of 8 stops, and it will let me do that in 1/10 of a stop increments. Now of course, that allows for extremely precise power adjustment from unit to unit to unit. If you've got more than one flash on the go, this can be incredibly useful, so you can balance the light from different units, or even if you're just done with one unit, because you might be trying to match the light from the ambient daylight you've got around, or the ambient light inside a building, and being able to adjust your output is extremely useful. Of course, it's also extremely useful at allowing you to get the exposure combination you want. You might want almost full power so you can get a very, very small aperture. Or you might want the opposite. You might want a tiny little of flash so you can maintain a nice wide aperture. Having that big range of power output to choose from is incredibly useful, and the more refined you can make the adjustments, again, the more useful it is. So that's definitely something to look for when you're choosing a flash. How fast a flash recycles can matter as well, of course. As I mentioned earlier, you may find it takes anything up to 9 or 10 seconds sometimes, and that can get quite tedious. Now, of course, the power setting the flash is set to will affect that more than anything, but you will find that certain units are just faster full stop than other units, and generally speaking, again, this does come down to what you pay for. Go and buy a cheap Chinese copy of something and you may find that the recycling time is appalling. By comparison, units like this, which are much more high end, will recycle bang, 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 and keep you shooting much, much faster. Having a range of different options for triggering the flash is also very, very useful. Again, the cheapest, most basic flash, you'll be able to trigger with nothing more than just a simple cable. That's fine, it'll work, but it'll be your only option. Something like this will let you use a simple cable. It also has a built-in optical slave, and it has radio channels which it will work to. Something like this has, obviously, the hot shoe that can attach to it. It can work off a dedicated cable. It's got a simple optical slave, and it will even use something called creative lighting system. Now, all of these we're going to come into in more depth later on, but obviously having that range of choices with higher end flash means that I'm not stuck. I don't get to a certain situation and think, oh, I've no way of triggering this flash because my cable won't reach, or it's too bright to use such and such a mode. Having lots of options just gives you more choices depending on what situations you find yourself in. Like I say, triggering is obviously a bit of a problem because these have to be synchronized with the camera, so the more range of triggering options you've got, the better you're going to be. Now, I already briefly mentioned that flashes can take a whole range of modifiers. And again, this is one of those things where getting involved in an established system like Profoto or Broncolor or similar will be a big advantage, because more stuff will fit them. And not only that, but you can, if you want, rent all sorts of bits and pieces for a much reduced cost than you would pay to buy them, because they'll fit your standard set of kit. And for example, the things that fit this Profoto head, which I've had for about 2 years or so, these will fit Profoto heads going back 15, 20 years or so, and vice versa. I can take modifiers of any sort made in the past 15, 20 years for Profoto and put them straight onto these lights. So I can walk into a hire studio almost anywhere in the world and plug these straight into softboxes, parabolic reflectors, snoots, grids, all sorts of modifiers. Whereas if I use, say, a much cheaper system, I'd have to put adapters on and all sorts of bits and pieces, or they might not fit at all, or they'd fit and be very loose and wobbly. Again, you get what you pay for. You can guess what I'm getting at. It really is worth investing in a decent system, because then everything fits and everything tends to work without much hassle. Now, if you're getting really technical, and I don't suggest we do on this course because it will start to get quite confusing, you might also want to look for a flash that's got a very short flash duration. This does get really finicky, but essentially not all flashes are as short as you think they are. And again, essentially you will get very, very short flash durations in more expensive units, though that's not always true. Of course, the shorter the duration, the better you'll freeze high-speed action, as you'll see in shots like this, which was done with a duration of somewhere in the region of 1/10,000th of a second. Don't worry too much about this, okay? Until you start to get deeply involved in high-speed photography, it's not really your concern. A flash is a flash is a flash as far as you're worried about. So, to sum it up, you'll get what you pay for in terms of build quality and what modifiers it will take. Also in terms of how quickly it recycles, your range of exposure options you've got with each unit, your choices of being able to trigger it, and then it's up to you whether you choose battery units or mains units. I would suggest starting with battery, and depending on how much you find yourself using it, then maybe adding mains later on. But don't forget the golden rule, flash is really somewhere where this applies, which is that you do get what you pay for.